Thank you for joining us today for Creating Life in the Laboratory. My guest today is Dr. Fuz Rana, who completed a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry at Ohio University, where he twice won the Donald Chippenger Research Award. Postdoctoral studies took him to the universities of Virginia and Georgia. He then worked for 7 years as a senior research scientist for Procter & Gamble. He's interested in truth. Are scientists going to discover life in the laboratory? And what are the implications for us as Christians and for the world? Welcome today to the Carter Report. Dr. Rana, welcome here today.
Thank you for having me, Pastor Carter.
We are delighted to have you come here. We appreciate all that you're doing. Are scientists really close to creating life in the laboratory? What are some of the implications?
Sure. Well, 10 years ago, that would have been fodder for science fiction, but it really has become science fact. It's a reality that's upon us. Scientists are really close to creating life in the lab. In fact, May of 2010, Craig Venter generated a lot of attention by announcing a method that he and his research collaborators developed so they can actually create a suite of artificial life forms in the lab. So this is a reality that's upon us.
This is new to me.
Yeah, well, most people would probably say there's no way scientists are going to create life in the lab. It's just way too complex. But the fact of the matter is, biochemists have been studying how life operates at its fundamental level and have learned enough about that they're able to apply that knowledge and really, again, are very close to being able to create artificial life forms.
When you're talking about life in the laboratory, what sort of life is it? What are these artificial life forms?
Well, they basically are like single cells. So nothing more complicated than a single-celled organism.
But how complicated is a single-cell organism?
Well, single-celled organisms are unbelievably complicated. The way to think about them is it's like a city inside the cell where the molecules are operating just like all the different types of activities going on in a city. And in fact, Craig Venter, who is one of the pioneers in trying to create life in the lab, has actually done some very good work at trying to understand the minimum complexity of life forms as part of the attempt to create life in the lab, and has determined that you need to have about 450 different genes in order for an organism to even function as a living entity.
Now we're talking about a single cell.
Exactly.
We're not talking about a baby or a human being or
nothing
a crocodile.
Like that. We're talking, yeah, exactly, just a single cell.
So they're not making complex.
No.
They're not trying to make complex life forms.
No, nothing like that at this point. And any idea of doing something like that is way beyond the technology.
So in a cell, 400 genes, that's the minimum?
Yeah, that's the minimum that you need. And each gene contains the information to make a protein, which is a large molecule that will carry out a specific activity inside the cell. So minimally, you're going to need about 450 different types of proteins that are going to be working in combination to carry out the basic operations of life.
How many molecules are we talking about for a simple cell?
You're looking at thousands and thousands of molecules.
Maybe millions.
Perhaps, yeah, depending on the type of molecule and the type of cell that you're dealing with.
So really, it's quite a job to try to do this. Somewhat a daunting task, isn't it?
Oh yeah, this is not trivial by any means. And in fact, some of the best scientists in the world today are working on the attempts to create life in the lab.
Why are scientists so interested in creating artificial life? And you say, this is a bit of a stunner to me because I thought they were light years away from approaching the threshold of creating life in the laboratory. Are we talking about a form of intelligent life?
No, these are not. This is not intelligent at all.
But doesn't a cell seem to have some intelligence?
Well, the cell, I would argue, is intelligently designed, and it is an automated system in that it can take care of itself. It operates according to a set of machinery that will automatically do everything that the cell needs to do.
When you say automatically, what do we mean by automatically?
Well, for example, the cell has certain trigger points that will tell it that it's time to divide. It's time to duplicate the DNA molecules and then undergo a cell division process where they get partitioned into the two daughter cells. And that after the cell division is taking place, the cell will enter into a growth phase. And certain of the machines will be turned on, other machines will be turned off. The cells can respond to stimuli in the environment. Are there nutrients in this particular location? It'll move in that direction towards the nutrients, will move away from toxic materials. And this is all, again, done automatically, but in order for that type of operation or sets of operations to take place, there's got to be an overarching intelligence that has, in a sense, designed and programmed that machinery to operate in such a way.
I find this incredibly amazing. I read somewhere, I think I may have read it in one of your books, where you said a cell is like a city.
Yes.
And they've got little factories and power supply and garbage disposal systems.
Exactly, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean the operations that are going on inside the cell, you have a membrane or a boundary that separates the inside from the outside. And that boundary is a very sophisticated machine in and of itself that has proteins that are letting material in, sending material out into the environment, responding to signals in the environment that will then turn on and turn off other operations inside the cell.
Now, you've actually seen this, haven't you, working?
Yes.
You can see this today.
You can depict it, yeah. In fact, many of the proteins that we're talking about literally are machines themselves that bear a startling similarity to man-made machines. So you have machines that have lever arms and hinges and rotors and bushings and all this good stuff.
Now, this is true. They have little lever arms.
Sure.
And hinges.
And hinges and rotors and stators and bushings and drive shafts.
Bushings.
Yes.
And shafts.
Yeah. So, in fact, these machines are virtually identical to the types of machines that we would build. In fact, though they're identical, they're more sophisticated in terms of their operation. They're more efficient than anything we can produce. So if you saw a machine laying on the side of the road, you immediately would conclude that there had to be an engineer and mechanics that designed and built that machine. And when you see those same machines inside the cell, that to me is evidence that there's a mind that has built those machines and built life.
Now, you're a scientist.
Yes.
I'm a pastor. What do I know about science? Only what I read in a few books that I've read down through the years. You say there are little machines, and they're intricate, and they're complex, and they're doing special tasks.
Yes.
Not how big, how tiny are these machines that you're talking about?
Well, they're on the order of nanometers in size. So a nanometer would be 1/1000th of a meter, or you could think about it roughly 1/100000th of a yard.
Yeah.
So these are incredibly tiny.
A billionth.
Yeah. So these are incredibly tiny systems.
You can't see these things.
No, you have to essentially piece their structure together through a number of different techniques, electron microscopy and X-ray diffraction and things like that.
See, you lost me already. I read somewhere where scientists are working on making these little tiny machines and popping them into your bloodstream.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's part of what's called nanoscience and nanotechnology. In the idea.
And these little things will go around in your bloodstream and fix up broken parts and stuff like this.
That's the idea. I mean, there's still a way from accomplishing those goals.
You think it's going to happen one day?
Yes, I do. And again, it's because for two reasons. One is we are learning more and more about how life operates at a fundamental level. And we're developing more and more sophisticated techniques to manipulate these molecules. And that's opening up vistas in terms of research and development that we just could only have dreamed of even 10 years ago. The rate of progress is incredible.
Here is the cell, which is incredibly complex, worked by incredibly tiny, efficient machines. Little trucks running around and little generators and little engines and all of this stuff disposal systems, power plants. I'm sort of quoting one of your books, I think. That's
Yes.
why I'm proficient in this part of my presentation here today. But why are scientists so keen, I mean, almost driven with an evangelistic zeal to create life in the laboratory?
Well, there's two reasons. It's easy to think about scientists as trying to usurp God's place, but that really isn't their motivation. Part of it is that
You don't think so?
No, not exclusively. There are.
What about Richard Dawkins?
Richard Dawkins is a different story, but the average scientist at the bench is doing this type of work for, I think, noble reasons. Maybe at points somewhat misguided, but still noble reasons. First of all, if the idea is that if we can make life in the lab, that means we have a better understanding of it than before, because to make something, you really need to understand it. But also, they look at this as a huge opportunity to really benefit humanity. For example, Craig Venter, who we've mentioned, wants to create artificial life forms, bacteria that will generate hydrogen gas that could be used as an alternative fuel source. There are some scientists who are trying to modify bacteria to make biodiesel at very high levels. Some scientists are trying to create bacteria that will produce cancer drugs that are very difficult to make, and in fact, in some cases, impossible to make. They've discovered these compounds in nature, but they can't really replicate their structure through chemical synthesis, so they're trying to rely on living organisms to make these compounds.
And is it not true also that they're trying to make a substance that will generate power that can maybe take the place of petroleum, bacteria, and all of this stuff?
Yes, exactly. So that would be the quest to make bacteria that produce biodiesel. And there's some success towards that end. So this is really exciting in many respects, because this is technology that I think can revolutionize our world and do it in a positive way.
It's not all anti-God by any means.
No,
it's a desire to benefit the human race, and also to solve the problem, where did man come from?
Sure.
How are scientists trying to create life in the laboratory? What steps are they taking?
Well, there's two different strategies that you see. One is called the top-down approach. And this is the idea where you'll take an existing bacteria and you try to re-engineer it and to such an extent that it's no longer recognizable as a natural life form. And so you might add a whole host of different genes that give it a completely novel metabolic capability that bacteria in nature don't have. So for example, bacteria may not naturally produce an anti-cancer compound, but if you can piece together a metabolic pathway by adding the right genes from a number of different organisms and doing some modifications, you might be able to get a bacteria that can make an anti-cancer compound.
But that's not creating life, is it?
No, it's really modifying life. But still, the claim that you'll see from scientists is that we've created an artificial life form. So it's very important, I think, for Christians to understand what's meant when scientists say we're creating artificial life. True, it's artificial in the sense that it's been manipulated by humans, that it's non-natural, it's not found in nature, but they really are re-engineering life using existing parts that are found in a whole host of living organisms. Nobody is starting from complete scratch at this point and making life that's completely different than anything that we're aware of.
Well, you know, in my humble opinion, I wouldn't see that as the creation of life. It is simply taking something that has life in it and adding to it or subtracting from it.
Right.
But now you said
and that's a valid way to think about it.
You said this was the approach from the top down.
Yes.
What's the other approach?
The other approach is the bottom up. And the top down approach is where you're seeing the most advances in the greatest amount of success. But the bottom up is the idea of going in the lab and starting with very simple chemicals and trying to literally build life piece by piece by piece, taking those smaller molecules, making larger, more complex molecules, encapsulating them within a membrane, getting that whole system to grow and divide.
So what you're saying, Doctor, is that what they're trying to do, is take that which is not living
Yes.
atoms which are not alive,
Yes.
and making them into molecules, and trying to make these things actually living substances. Is this the theory?
Yeah, that's the idea. There are some research teams that are doing some quite remarkable things that I would think that approach within the next decade may actually realize some success.
What are they doing in these laboratories?
Well,
When you say they're doing some remarkable things.
Well, for example, they're trying to identify compounds that would function like DNA. DNA is a very large molecule that harbors the information needed for the entire cell to operate. And so they're trying to develop alternatives to DNA that would be large molecules that could harbor information that can undergo a replication process to produce daughter molecules.
Now, most of my friends who are watching this television program, if they're like me, would say, how does this work? You know, this is somewhat over our heads. How do scientists in a laboratory, in the lab, how do they stick together atoms and molecules so that those things will be able to reproduce or harbor information like DNA? How are they trying to do this?
Well, and this is where I think the greatest amount of excitement is in store for us as Christians when we think about this type of work, because these are not trivial enterprises where the scientists are rolling out of bed in the morning and just throwing some chemicals into a test tube and shaking it up, and out pops an interesting molecule or maybe even a complex system that's starting to look like life. They are sitting down and developing incredibly elaborate strategies.
How do they do this physically? How do you do this?
It's mostly done in your mind, believe it or not. It's developing the strategy based on decades and decades of research and understanding about how the molecules are working. And then once that strategy is in place, some of the brightest and most capable scientists in the world are in the lab doing extremely careful manipulations, controlling the conditions in the lab.
How do they manipulate them? I mean, I can manipulate my glasses
Yes.
and these sheets of paper, and I can lift up the Bible.
Right.
How do you manipulate something you can't even see?
Well, it's, you're adding chemicals into test tubes. You're adding them in the right amounts and the right proportions. You're controlling the conditions. You're stopping the reaction at the right time. So it's basically chemical manipulations in the lab, but it's under very carefully controlled, highly pristine conditions that you're doing the manipulations. So it's done at a test tube level, but there's enough understanding as to how the molecules interact that you're able to, through the strategy, control what they're doing in such a way that out pops more complex molecules that might have interesting properties. But it's literally teams of hundreds of scientists at times that are engaged in these types of activities that are producing even the initial steps towards life in the lab.
This is a new frontier, isn't it?
It's a brand new frontier. But what's exciting to me about this is the ingenuity that's required in order to bring about this accomplishment, the strategy that's involved. As a scientist, when I look at what's being accomplished and I look at how clever the approach is, I just sit back and I marvel at what these scientists have been able to accomplish. And in a sense, what they're demonstrating is that apart from an intelligent agent, or in fact, a room full of intelligent agents, it's impossible even to approach creating life in the lab. So it's a powerful argument that what we see in nature must be the work of an intelligent agent, because there's no way something like that, we know now, there's no way that something like what we see in nature could ever come into existence all on its own, given how hard it is for scientists to generate these crude artificial life forms.
Fuzz, hopefully we have folks watching this telecast today who maybe are struggling with the issues of belief in God. Maybe they're university students and they're being bombarded with facts and information, and they're being told there is no God. What you're saying is this, that these intelligent people who are doing these great experiments they're not just throwing stuff at random, but they're doing this with intelligence, with great care, great concern, great control. And this in itself is an argument for an intelligent being who started the human race.
Yeah, that's exactly the argument. And again, the amount of expertise that's required to pull this off, the workforce that's required. They're utilizing instruments that are $1 million instruments. Some of them are unique instruments that these researchers have spent decades building just simply to aid in this process of creating life in the lab. And they're standing on the shoulders of generation after generation after generation of scientists who've come before them.
Of intelligent life forms.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we can look at the cell and we can say, this cell sure appears to be designed to me. It has all these characteristics that I think reflect the work of a designer. Someone like Richard Dawkins can come along and say, no, evolution produced that design. So in a sense, it's a toss-up. It's a question of what do you prefer as the explanation to some extent. But we now have people in the lab trying to create life themselves. That to me is the tiebreaker. Life appears to be designed, and to bring life about requires, again, the incredible effort on the part of intelligent agents to bring it into existence. So to me, that is a powerful argument that God must be necessary for life.
It sort of overwhelms me that people could think all of this just happened by itself. A friend of mine said that if life started with a zero, and if life ends with a zero, then everything in between is a zero. And there's nothing right, and there's nothing wrong, and there's nothing good, and there's nothing beautiful. There's no such thing as love, and we might as well live like barbarians because we've come from nothing and we're going to nothing.
Yeah.
You referred to Richard Dawkins. Did you see the DVD, the movie produced by, I think it was Ben Stein? Is it
Yes.
Ben Stein? He's a Jewish comedian.
Yes.
And he's interviewing Dr. Dawkins.
Yes.
I thought this was absolutely wonderful because he said to Dr. Dawkins, now, you don't believe in intelligent design, do you? And Dr. Dawkins said, no, that's these Christian people who believe this, they're somewhat ignorant. No intelligent person would believe in intelligent design. Oh, he said, do you think that life just happened by itself? Well, he said, no. Remember what he said? He said, I do believe in intelligent design. The man who has written books against it and railed against the concept that there is a creator God, he said, when you look at the cell and other bits of nature, it seems as though it has been designed. But he said it wasn't designed by God. It was obviously designed by an intelligent, superior race somewhere out there in the universe. And it was transported to this earth. And he said, we're the product of this intelligent race. Ben Stein said to him, but of course, that intelligent being couldn't be God, could it? He said, no, of course not, it couldn't be God. No, but he said, it had to come from an intelligent source. And so what you're telling me today is that the very process that scientists are following to make life intelligent, no, not intelligent life, but artificial life in itself is a proof that life has to be intelligently created.
I think so. And people like Richard Dawkins who don't believe in God will agree that when you look at biochemical systems, as you mentioned, when you look at living systems, that they really do appear to be designed. In his book, I believe it's The Blind Watchmaker, Dawkins says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So everybody recognizes that these systems appear to be designed. The question is that designer evolution? Is it an alien intelligence, or is it the God of the Bible? And I think it's just as reasonable to conclude it's the God of the Bible than any of those other two options. And I think many times the resistance to drawing the conclusion that it's a creator that brought life into being is not the scientific evidence, but it's rather a philosophical objection, or maybe even a rebellious spirit against against the Creator, because as soon as you acknowledge that a Creator exists, there are very important questions that follow. Who is that Creator, and how do I relate to that Creator? Do I have responsibility to that Creator? So I think that many times people use science as an excuse not to follow the evidence where it naturally leads.
I'm talking to Dr. Rana. The topic is creating life in the laboratory. Be with us, stay with us, and we'll be back in just a minute or two after this important message.